Chapter 14, Part 3. While Booth and his conspirators made their final plans, one was to murder Vice President Johnson, another to kill Secretary of State Seward, the Lincolns enjoyed a particularly pleasant day together. The two spent a leisurely time riding and chatting during a carriage drive through the city. They even took the time to visit the Navy Yard and inspect 3 Union ironclad warships recently damaged at the battle for Fort Fisher in North Carolina. Along the way, the Lincolns talked about their future. They would go home someday to live out their years in Illinois. Perhaps they could first visit California or even the Holy Land. But first, the president wanted his wife to emerge from the long shadow of mourning, just as he hoped the country would as well. Between the war and the loss of our darling Willie, we have both been very miserable, Lincoln whispered to his wife. We must both be more cheerful in the future. When they returned to the White House, Lincoln went back for a time to his desk. The last notes he wrote were a letter to a Union general pledging to work for a union of hearts and hands as well as of the states, and a pass for a Massachusetts congressman to visit him the next day. Allow Mr. Ashmun and friend to come in at 9 a.m. tomorrow. By the time he scribbled those final words, the Lincolns were late for the theater. They rode to Senator Ira Harris's nearby house to pick up their guests for the evening, the senator's daughter Clara and her fiancé, Major Henry Rathbone, and then dashed to Ford's, where the play was well underway when they stepped through the doors. Nevertheless, when the actors spied the figure of the tall man in the black making his way to the especially arranged presidential box above the stage, they stopped their performance. The band struck up "Hail to the Chief," and the audience erupted in cheers and applause. When Lincoln reached his seat above a beautiful display of red, white, and blue bunting, he bowed and smiled at the ovation. Then he sat down and the play resumed. The last thing some members of the audience remembered was the sight of the president pulling back the drapery on his left so he could peer into the audience. The last thing his guests, Miss Harris and Major Rathbone, saw was the sight of Lincoln gently taking Mary's hand and holding it in his own. At around 10:20 p.m., Booth crept into the theater, tiptoed around the balcony, just as Lincoln had done, entered the presidential box, and closed the door behind him. Then, just as the audience gave out a roar of laughter at the funny line Booth had been waiting for, he snuck up behind the president and at close range shot him in the back of the head with a small pistol. Before anyone knew what was happening, Booth jumped to the stage below, screamed out the Latin motto of Virginia, "Si semper tyrannis," which means "thus ever to tyrants," and raced into the wings and out the theater's back door. Lincoln's face instantly fell forward. He would never open his eyes again. Around the same time, Lewis Powell pushed his way into William Seward's home and tried to stab him to death in his bed. Another of Booth's gang, George Atzerodt, got cold feet and failed to follow his instructions to kill Andrew Johnson. Inside Ford's theater, members of the audience froze in their seats, then erupted in a pandemonium of screaming when they saw the cloud of smoke rising from the president's box and realized what had happened. A doctor pushed his way to Lincoln's side and examined his wounds, pronouncing him fatally wounded. Then a small group of men gently carried the stricken president out into the crowded street and placed him in the back bedroom of a small boarding house just across from the theater. Many men would not have lived even minutes after such an injury. Lincoln lived for 9 hours. At 7:22 a.m. the next morning, Abraham Lincoln died, surrounded by a handful of government officials and his son Robert, with Mary in the nearby parlor. He was the first president to be assassinated. By the time Lincoln's body had been returned to Springfield for burial, he had become more than a successful president and commander-in-chief, more even than an emancipator. In part because his death occurred so close to Easter Sunday, ministers compared him to Jesus, who, they pointed out, also died for his nation's sins. Because his death came during the Jewish holiday of Passover, rabbis likened him to Moses, who had freed his people from slavery, but not lived to see the promised land. Almost overnight, Abraham Lincoln became a national saint. The days of partisan politics, controversy, and vicious press criticism ended the moment he died. Thanks to Lincoln, however, freedom would live. Modern Americans still search for an answer to the question of whether Abraham Lincoln deserves the title Great Emancipator. Should he be given credit for freeing the slaves by issuing his Emancipation Proclamation and masterminding passage of the 13th Amendment? Despite his modest protests about letting events control his leadership, was he far ahead of the vast majority of Americans on the subjects of freedom and equality? Or was he maddeningly slow to catch up? Frederick Douglass praised Lincoln as, quote, the black man's president, end quote, when he eulogized him in New York shortly after the assassination. In the years that followed, however, as Southerners blocked civil rights for black people, Douglass thought harder and longer about the subject. In 1876, he appeared in Washington on the 11th anniversary of the assassination to speak at the dedication of a memorial statue funded entirely by donations from African Americans. His verdict was mixed. The man he had called the, quote, black man's president 11 years earlier now seemed to him to have been preeminently the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of the white man. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln, he told the whites in the audience. You are at best only his stepchildren. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln, he told the whites in the audience. We are at best only his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by forces of circumstances and necessity. If Douglass had once resented Lincoln for delaying freedom, now he was at last ready to thank him for ordering it when he did. Our faith in him was often taxed and strained to the utmost, but it never failed. It mattered little to us when we finally knew him, whether he was swift or slow in his movements. It was enough for us that Abraham Lincoln was at the head of a great movement. Douglass had perhaps finally come to understand the man he had often criticized and just as often praised. Viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of his countrymen, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. He was, as Douglass concluded later that day, and as history has echoed ever since, a liberator. The last time they had met, Abraham Lincoln had told Frederick Douglass, I hate slavery as much as you do, and I want to see it abolished altogether. Lincoln died 8 months before that dream finally came true with ratification of the 13th Amendment, but he has kept his word to make sure it was abolished altogether. 8 years earlier, Lincoln had wondered aloud what made American independence special, its power or its promise. It was not, he concluded, our frowning battlements, our bristling seacoasts, the guns of our war steamers, or the strength of our gallant and disciplined army. After all, he urged, all of them may be turned against our liberties without making us stronger or weaker for the struggle. Our reliance is in the love of liberty which God has planted in our bosoms. I want to share with you one of the pictures here where Lincoln had been carried across the street after he had been shot. Look at all the people surrounding him in his deathbed. Lincoln's deathbed, another Courier and Ives print. In truth, no artist was present as the president lay dying in a boarding house across the street from the theater where he was shot. So this is an artist interpretation of what it looked like based on what people told the artist, because there were no artists present, but there were lots of other people. This book has a great appendix with the cast of characters. It says there's a timeline here. I also have another book at school that I would have preferred to read over this one. It was actually about the assassination. The whole book is about the assassination and the plot to kill President Lincoln, which I thought was a little easier for kids to understand, but it didn't have as much to do with the freeing of the slaves. It was more about John Wilkes Booth and his plan and his attempt at escape. If any of you are interested in any of that, if anybody wants this book, let me know. I will get it to you. And once I can get into school, I would be happy to lend to anybody else that other book. So just let me know. I hope you enjoyed this somewhat and learned something. That's the end.